The year was the 30th, in the 4th month, on the 5th day. For a man named Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, time had become a repetitive cycle of dust and heat. He was a priest without a temple, a man born to serve in the magnificent halls of Solomon's temple, but now he sat among the captives of Judah by the river Chebar in the land of the Chaldeans. The atmosphere was one of stagnant despair. The exiles were people who had lost their identity, their land, and their God. But on that specific day, the heavens were not just silent observers of human misery. They were a veil, and that veil was about to be torn asunder. As Ezekiel sat by the water, a storm unlike any in recorded history began to brew in the north. This was no ordinary weather pattern. It was a massive, towering cloud enfolding a fire that spiraled within itself, emitting a radiance like chasmal, the glow of burnished metal emerging from a furnace. From the heart of this celestial fire, the impossible began to take shape. 4 living beings emerged. To the human eye, they possessed a form that defied earthly logic. Each had 4 faces, the face of a human for wisdom, a lion for majesty, an ox for strength, and an eagle for divine vision. Their wings brushed against one another, creating a sound like the roar of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty Himself. Beside these creatures were the Ophanim, wheels within wheels. These were not primitive wooden constructs. Their rims were so high they were fearsome, and they were studded with thousands of eyes, symbolizing a God who sees every corner of the dark universe. When the creatures moved, the wheels moved. When they rose, the wheels rose. This was the Merkabah, the chariot of the divine, a mobile throne that proved to Ezekiel, and to us, that God is not a local deity confined to a stone building in Jerusalem. He is the sovereign of the cosmos, and He had come to the mud pits of Babylon to find His people. Above the heads of the creatures was an expanse like awesome crystal, and above that, a throne of sapphire. Seated there was a figure of fire and amber, surrounded by a rainbow. Ezekiel, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of this glory, did what any mortal would do: he fell on his face in the dirt. But the vision was only the beginning of the ordeal. A voice, sounding like the crash of a waterfall, commanded him, "Son of man, stand on your feet." God did not want a broken man, He wanted a messenger. A hand reached out from the radiance, holding a scroll. On both sides, it was covered in writing, lamentations, mourning, and woe. The command was terrifying: eat this scroll. Ezekiel opened his mouth and swallowed the words of God's judgment. In an incredible twist of divine irony, the scroll tasted as sweet as honey. This is the first great lesson of Ezekiel: even when God's truth is bitter in its content, it is sweet in its source. To know the will of God, even if it is a word of correction, is better than being left in the dark. Ezekiel was then commissioned as the watchman of Israel. His job was not to be popular, it was to be faithful. God warned him that the people he was sent to were hard-headed and stiff-hearted. They were like briars and thorns, like scorpions surrounding him. But Ezekiel was told not to fear them. God made Ezekiel's forehead like emery, harder than flint, so he could stand against their rebellion. The responsibility was absolute: if Ezekiel failed to warn the wicked man, that man would die for his sin, but God would hold Ezekiel accountable for his blood. If he did warn them, and they refused to listen, the blood was on their own heads. For 7 days after this encounter, Ezekiel sat in total silence among the exiles at Tel Abib. He was overwhelmed, a man who had seen the sun and could no longer look at the shadows of the earth. To get the attention of a people who had grown deaf to words, God turned Ezekiel into a living sign. For the next several chapters, the prophet engaged in a series of bizarre, prophetic street theater performances. He took a clay brick and sketched the city of Jerusalem on it, then built a miniature siege wall around it. He lay on his left side for 390 days to represent the years of Israel's sin, and then 40 days on his right side for Judah. He was a human clock, counting down the patience of God. He was forced to cook his bread over cow dung, symbolizing the extreme defilement and famine that was about to strike the holy city. He took a sharp sword and used it as a barber's razor, shaving his head and beard. He weighed the hair: a third he burned, a third he struck with the sword, and a third he scattered to the wind. It was a grim, visual forecast: Jerusalem would be consumed by plague, sword, and exile. In the 6th year, the Spirit of God seized Ezekiel by a lock of his hair and transported him across the desert to the temple in Jerusalem. What he saw there was a horror story. In the very place where the name of God was supposed to dwell, there were idols of jealousy. He saw 70 elders of the house of Israel in a dark room, burning incense to creeping things and abominable beasts. He saw women weeping for Tammuz, a pagan deity of vegetation. He saw men with their backs to the temple, bowing toward the rising sun in the east. This was the abomination of desolation in its primitive form. Because of this, Ezekiel watched the most heart-wrenching scene in the Old Testament. The glory of the Lord, that magnificent, rainbow-circled fire, slowly rose from the cherubim. It moved to the threshold of the temple. It hovered over the east gate. And finally, it left the city entirely, moving to the Mount of Olives. The house was empty. The presence had departed. The middle of Ezekiel's journey is a dark valley of judgment, not just for Israel, but for the nations. He turns his face toward the surrounding kingdoms, Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and the great merchant city of Tyre. Tyre was the New York or London of its day, a maritime superpower that thought its wealth made it a god. Ezekiel's prophecy against the prince of Tyre is legendary, describing a being who was the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, but whose heart became proud. Many see in this a dual prophecy, echoing the fall of a celestial being, and that pride is the root of all ruin. Egypt, too, was weighed in the scales. Pharaoh, who called himself a great monster in the Nile, was told he would be dragged out with hooks and left to rot in the open fields. God was making it clear, there is no superpower on earth that is not subject to the King of the universe. Then came the news that changed everything. A fugitive arrived from Jerusalem and told the exiles, "The city has fallen." The silence of judgment was over. Now, the tone of Ezekiel shifts from the thunder of the storm to the hope of the morning. God begins to speak of a new covenant. He lambasts the shepherds of Israel, the leaders who fed themselves but let the sheep starve and be scattered. God makes a startling promise, "I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out." He speaks of a future prince from the line of David who will feed them. He promises to gather the people from the nations, not because they are good, but for the sake of his holy name. This is where we hear the famous promise, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." This promise of internal transformation leads to the most famous vision in the book, the Valley of Dry Bones. Ezekiel is set down in a valley that is literally white with the remains of a slaughtered army. The bones are very dry, meaning hope is long dead. God asks the impossible question, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel, wise enough to know he doesn't know, says, "O Lord God, you know." As Ezekiel prophesies to the bones, a rattling sound begins, a sound of structural reconstruction. Bone joins to bone. Sinews and flesh cover them. But they are still corpses. Then God tells him to prophesy to the Ruach, the wind, the breath, the spirit. As the breath enters them, they stand up on their feet, an exceedingly great army. This was a message to the exiles who said, "Our hope is lost." God was saying, "I will open your graves and bring you up from them." It is a foreshadowing of the resurrection, both of a nation and of the human soul. Following this resurrection comes the prophecy of the great conflict. Ezekiel describes a mysterious figure named Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. In the latter years, this force will descend upon the restored land of Israel like a cloud covering the land. They come for silver, gold, and cattle, to plunder a people who think they are safe. But this invasion is a divine trap. God reveals that he will summon a sword against Gog on all his mountains. Through torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur, God will execute judgment. The scale of the defeat is so massive that it takes 7 months to bury the dead to cleanse the land. This represents the final defeat of all powers that oppose the kingdom of God, clearing the way for the ultimate restoration. The final section of Ezekiel, from chapter 40 to 48, is often the most difficult for readers, but it is the most glorious for the visionary. It is the 25th year of the exile. Ezekiel is taken to a very high mountain where he sees what looks like a city. A man with a face like bronze and a measuring line in his hand begins to walk Ezekiel through a new temple. For chapter after chapter, we get the precise dimensions, the thickness of the walls, the number of steps to the gates, the tables for the sacrifices, the chambers for the priests. Why such detail? Because to an exile who had lost everything, detail is a sign of reality. This was not a vague dream, it was a blueprint. But the most important part of the building was not the stone, it was the guest. Ezekiel watches as the glory of the Lord, the same chariot of fire he saw 25 years earlier, returns from the east. The radiance fills the temple, and a voice says, "This is the place of my throne, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever." The temple is restored, the priesthood is purified, and the land is redistributed among the 12 tribes, including the foreigners who live among them. The climax of the entire 48-chapter epic occurs in the final vision of the river of life. Ezekiel sees water trickling out from under the threshold of the temple, flowing toward the east. The man with the measuring line takes Ezekiel out 1,000 cubits, the water is ankle deep. Another 1,000, it is knee deep. Another 1,000, it is waist deep. Finally, it is a river that cannot be forded, a river one must swim in. This river flows into the Araba, the desert, and empties into the Dead Sea. In a miracle of ecology and spirit, the salt waters become fresh. Swarms of living creatures live wherever the river goes. On both banks, every kind of fruit tree grows. Their leaves do not wither, and their fruit does not fail, because the water flows from the sanctuary. The leaves are for healing and the fruit is for food. This is the ultimate trajectory of the prophet Ezekiel. He started by a river of sorrow in Babylon, and he ended by a river of life in the presence of God. The book does not end with a list of rules or an architectural diagram. It ends with a name. The city is measured, the gates are named after the tribes: Reuben, Judah, Levi, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and Simeon. And the name of the city from that day forward shall be Yahweh Shammah, the Lord is there. This is the heartbeat of the Bible. From the Garden of Eden to the New Jerusalem in Revelation, the goal of God has always been to be there with his people. Ezekiel, the watchman, the priest, the actor, and the visionary, leaves us with the assurance that no matter how dry the bones or how deep the exile, the glory is moving, the river is flowing, and the Lord is coming home.